Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to be taking a look at the founding of the United States. We have seen this country created by the Revolutionary War, the social impact that happened following the war. Now we're going to take a look at the political and economic ramifications that came with, okay, now we have a country. What are we going to do with it? How's it going to look? How's it going to act? All those specifics, all the debates, all the outlining thoughts from the Age of Enlightenment through practical application are coming to a head, and this is what we get. So let's get started. There were some significant advantages that the United States had early on. For example, we were isolated from nearby other nations. If you look at Western Europe, you can see Spain, France, Germany, and England are going to be in an area that's about the same size as the American Southwest. And these nations are very close to each other, don't always like each other, but we didn't have that. We had an ocean on one side and a good border between us and the Spanish to the south and us and the British to the north. Most of the population is relatively young, willing to accept and see some different kinds of change. We see that, broadly speaking, there's property divided amongst the people, and most people are literate. The downside is that the entire western half of our new nation was not secure. The end of the war meant that the proclamation line was a jagged idea of where the border was, but that's really all it was. Most people are going to live near the Atlantic coast where they had landed, and large areas to the west were controlled by Native American tribes that did not want to give it up by any way, despite the fact that the initial Americans felt that they had every right to just go in and take it. The British still had military forces in this region. Spain controlled the port of New Orleans, which was the hub of river traffic and even water-based traffic for those eastern states. The Constitution that existed in this country during the Revolutionary War years was the Articles of Confederation. It established the government that got us through the Revolution and even shortly thereafter. It was a national system where each state had one right to vote. Any decision you wanted to make needed 9 states to agree for a change, and all states to agree to amend anything significant. As you can see, this wasn't the most fluid system, and this system also cannot tax. So unless you get everyone together in the room all agreeing on the same thing, nothing's going to get done. And you can look at any group of any people and see that, wow, that's just not going to happen at all. So, to say the least, this system was not good. The Congress that existed because the Articles of Confederation had the powers that were important to get us through the war. They couldn't tax. All the wealth that the country created during the war was contributed by the local states. Most of our Native American population here is going to support England during the Revolution because the treaties with land were held by the British government, not the American people. With the Revolution over, there's lots of settlers who are going to want to go into this Native American land. And that creates this big land disputes between the landowners, the people who want to settle on the land, the people who are speculating the wealth of the land, and the Native Americans who actually live there. And the rush for this cheap land created a lot of problems and a lot of chaos. To establish a sense of governance over these new frontier states, the Ordinance of 1784 was passed, and it divided the western districts into governing almost provinces. And you can see where these districts are created on this picture, and you can kind of see where some of them are going to be states. For every part of this new West, it was dedicated to self-governance. It was dedicated not just to getting people there, but having a system in place for those people. Every 16th square mile that was populated is going to be set up just for money for education. And this is because otherwise there would be no way to collect any kind of taxation money to support any kind of education infrastructure. Now, this isn't going to be like public schools, nothing that complex yet, but it will be more based on trade concepts. And by trade, I mean like a trade, a skill, masonry, carpentry, blacksmithing, that kind of stuff. Eventually, when there's enough people living in a district would be admitted into the Union as a state. The idea in 1784 also was, hey, let's also make sure no slavery in this region. And that was rejected. Well, there was one vote that rejected it. One southern state said, no, we need slaves in this area too. If that had not gone that way, then slavery would have been isolated to 5 states and it would have died a century earlier. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 planned out the grid pattern of these new districts. And this was really mathematically lined out for the grids for what it's going to look like. It also said how many people could be in a territory before it became ruled over. The idea is that a territory was ruled by a single governor until you get about 5,000 people who are in there. At 5,000 people, the territorial legislature is created and sends delegates to Congress. It's not a state yet, but it now has a voice in the new government. These new land ordinances are going to allow for an orderly way for states to be created and to be admitted into the Union. The land ordinances are going to create Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. And at this point, whenever the populace of a territory reached 60,000, it can apply for statehood. And pretty frequently when that happened, it's pretty much green lit. The government that is established in these states will be a republic, just like the federal government, and will outlaw slavery. It also said that the Indian land could be taken without consent. So you could take the land from Native Americans without giving them anything. One of the biggest problems that the Articles of Confederation had is they didn't allow you to tax people. You could not tax the public and do anything with tax money. And this is really bad when you consider how much of both state and federal governments rely on tax money to do anything. Congress borrowed during the war lots of money by selling these interest-bearing bonds. If you bought one of these bonds, when you bought it, there was also a date on it that said you could turn it in. And the interest on the bond is how you would make money on it. These still exist today. It's a good way to generate cash very quickly. The problem is when the due date comes due, you have to pay the full amount of that note with the interest. If you don't have that money on hand, then these notes, you still have to pay these notes. You're legally obligated to do so. But if you don't have the interest on it, as well as the full cash, you're going to be in the red very fast. And that's where Congress finds itself. Foreign goods are hitting the American market. This hurts American business because it's causing an outflow of cash, it's causing an outflow of produce, of products, of everything. And Congress has first plan on fixing this was, let's just print more money. But when they did that, it devalued the currency. When you can just print it to say, here, we'll fix it, here's cash for nothing, that cash is then worthless. There were some short-term fixes that were put into place. States started imposing tariffs on those foreign goods and raising taxes. It didn't make the people there very happy, but it does start generating cash pretty quickly. Farmers and craftsmen, unfortunately, were not always able to pay these new taxes, and states that printed large amounts of paper money are going to find, yeah, you can pay your debts with this, but when that currency becomes useless, it doesn't work anymore. See, this isn't just the states printing money like Texas printing American dollars. This is Texas printing money for just the state of Texas. This Texas money, you would need to exchange it if you went anywhere. So if you went to Oklahoma, you'd have to exchange it for Oklahoma dollars in a lot of the same ways that if you go to France or England or Germany, you may have to swap out your currency. In the late 1780s, we see a group of farmers led by Daniel Shea in a real pickle. These are folks who have these giant tax liens against them, and they believe very adamantly that they're about to lose their land, they're about to lose their farms, they're about to lose their everything, and they are about to. And this group, and they're going to call themselves the regulators, go into courts and close down tax collecting courts. The goal of this is they want to make sure that they can protect what they have. They use the symbols of the revolution of the symbols that they use from the revolution are all about protecting individual rights, protecting individual lands, protecting the property that you had. And this escalated so much so that the Massachusetts governor had to use the militia to put down the rebellion, and over 1,000 people were arrested for this. The American elite was really alarmed that so many people would react so badly when things were going, yes, they were going badly, but these folks believed that essential government was needed to stabilize the economy, to protect private property, and to ensure that public liberty, the unchecked power of the people, wouldn't endanger the personal liberty or property rights of other folk. Led by Alexander Hamilton, 6 delegates, or delegates from 6 different states, discussed how can we fix interstate commerce? How can we regulate international commerce? And they proposed in Philadelphia that we need to amend the Articles of Confederation. They just weren't strong enough. They weren't working. And when they saw Shea's rebellion happening, they realized we got to do this kind of quickly. The people are rising up right now. And if we don't fix this thing real quick, our new government might not last. Except for Rhode Island, every state sent delegates, and in May of 1787, the delegates agreed we can't just amend the Articles of Confederation. We can't just fix them. We have to scrap them and start an entirely new system. The new Constitutional Convention was filled with some of the most prominent Americans, some founding fathers. Even George Washington is there. He was chosen as president of the convention because of his prestige and his impact on everything that had happened so far. The only 2 notable individuals who weren't there were Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Both of them were in Europe working as diplomats to secure international alliances and to let the world know that, yes, this group of colonies was really a country now. And this whole convention was kept in secret. It was held in private. The purpose of this was you didn't want the public to be able to sway the minds and hearts of the people who were engaged in this. Some components of the new Constitution that come into existence, we have three branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch. The legislative branch will create the laws, the executive branch will make sure that the laws are followed, and the judicial branch interprets when the law is broken. The power of each branch is separate so that one cannot overstep into the other. For example, the judicial branch cannot create laws. The legislative branch cannot say, hey, you have broken the law. Congress had very specific powers, so did the president, so did the judges. And the first big power that Congress gets is how to raise money. The government that's going to exist will be a republic based on popular sovereignty, what we would call a democratic republic. It's based on the idea of federalism that says that you share the power between the federal government, the state government, and the national government. The federal government has control over the military, they can make treaties, and they could regulate interstate and international trade. One of the hottest items of debate in this early government is how are we going to have people represented? Conflict was two parts. Should it be based on population, or should it be based on a strict number of how many people per state? And that's the two plans that were knocked around. The Virginia plan says that you should have one house where the legislative representation is based on how many people live in a state. So if there's more people living in Virginia than there are in New York, then there are more legislatures from Virginia. The argument was, hey, there's more people living here, they should get more votes. The downside is that meant small states would have no way to really have a voice in this government. The New Jersey plan also said, hey, let's have one house, but have each state get just one vote. And this was also knocked down for the exact same reason. When you have small states, yes, the New Jersey plan does benefit the small state with fewer people living in it, but it also means that there's fewer representation for it. The compromise that came out of this was the Connecticut Compromise, the Great Compromise. It said, let's have two houses. We have the Senate, and this is what we get. We get the Senate, the upper house, where each state sends two representatives, and they serve for 6-year terms. And then we have our lower house, which is based on representation, based on population. And they serve 2-year terms. This is our difference between congresspersons and senators. The Electoral College, well, figuring out presidential elections, that was proving pretty chaotic. The issue, well, one of the first issues that we see is who controlled who becomes president. And instead of a strict popular election, which we had seen for virtually every aspect of governance at this point, our early founding fathers believed that the common person was not smart enough to be able to make that decision. And the Electoral College would make that decision directly. If that might sound a little silly, but that's what it was, and that's what we still have. Even how the vice president is chosen, that was radically different. Nowadays, you vote for a person, and that person chooses who their running mate is going to be, who their vice president is going to be. In the 18th century, the person who got the most number of votes becomes president, but whoever gets the second most number of votes becomes the vice president. And that, as you can imagine, did not always go well. I mean, imagine if that had happened now in the 21st century with the elections of 2012, 2016, 2020. If one person got the most number of votes and the second person got the second number of votes, you would most likely have people from very, very different backgrounds with very different political beliefs who are trying to share power in the executive branch, and that just wouldn't work. And that problem was addressed relatively quickly. There were some big ideas that didn't make it into our first constitution, our true constitution, and one was, and this was proposed by Madison, that Congress should be able to veto any state law. That was rejected. There was the idea that the national legislature was the law of the land. They could make laws that states had to follow, like it or not. States were barred from printing money. They couldn't deal with tariffs, they couldn't deal with trade. These were ideas that were knocked around, but ultimately. When it came to slaves, the issue of slavery, first issue of slavery really, was what are we going to do about it? And Congress set up a 20-year period of time between once the Constitution was signed. They'd say slavery, the slave trade, could keep going for 2 decades. After that, it's not going to exist anymore. If your state was the federal government also said that if you were a runaway slave, then whoever found you had to return you. And in some cases, runaway slaves were given if you caught a runaway slave, you were given a cash amount. When it came to representation for slaves, they did technically count as people. They counted as 3/5 of a person. This meant that states that have a lot of slaves can count each slave as 3/5 of a person towards representation and taxes. So even though slaves were considered property and not actually people, they did count as people, well, almost a person, when it came to how many seats in Congress and states' taxation policies that you got. The last session of the Constitution Convention was 1787 and September 17th. Franklin told all the delegates, we need to accept this thing as quickly as possible so we can make this the law of the land for everyone. And especially with the fear of another rebellion, this was kind of hurried up. 45 of the 39 delegates signed the Constitution that day, and then it went to the states for ratification. You needed 9 states to ratify this new Constitution. And there was a lot of fighting between states of should we do this or not do this. Some states, like Delaware, ratified it immediately. In New York, though, there was some pushback. There were people who said, we don't want this big, powerful government. We want something smaller, something we can manage. That's our anti-federalist group. And then you've got the Federalists who say, we need this thing. This is how we can all work together. This is how this great nation can work and function. To get people to agree and see the benefit of a constitution like this, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay wrote a series of essays called the Federalist Papers, and they were designed so that you could convince people we need this type of government. We need this system. The Anti-Federalists did include some noteworthy individuals. John Hancock, the first man to sign the Declaration of Independence. Samuel Adams, prominent Bostonian merchant and shipper, and not the same guy as the beer. Patrick Henry, the man who said, give me liberty or give me death. They believed that this was the loss of liberty. And When it was all said and done, Rhode Island and North Carolina voted against ratification, but ultimately agreed to it when they realized that they were about to be left out in the cold. Northern states are going to start emancipating. That means freeing slaves quicker. And some individuals like Hamilton and Jay and Franklin were active abolitionists. They tried to end slavery as quick as they possibly could. Initially, most free African Americans enjoyed the rights of every other citizen, including the right to vote. But the Naturalization Act of 1790 defined citizenship as belonging to, quote, free white persons. So that started evaporating for African Americans then. When it comes to slavery and Jefferson, there's definitely an interesting thing about it. Because he writes that all men are created equal, but he also owned hundreds of slaves. He believed that Native Americans could be as intelligent as whites, and over time, those two groups should intermarry. But Jefferson also said that blacks were unfit to be economically independent. They couldn't govern themselves, and that's why they had to maintain that slave status. Things get more complicated when you look at Jefferson's views on this, when you look at his relations with Sally Hemings, one of his slaves, who he had a couple of kids with. This idea of contradictory attitude, it's definitely a noodle scratcher. But I digress. Today we took a look at how this country's practical political system came into existence, how its governing body came into existence, and how its attitudes towards slaves and Black Americans were shaped. Hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.